Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Casa Italiana Zerilli-marimò. My name is Bill Ronayne. I'm the president of the American Italian Cultural Roundtable. On behalf of our board, I welcome you to our first event for the 24-25 season of promoting Italian culture, which we have been doing for 40 years. And we'll be celebrating our 40th anniversary right here on December 12th with the Christmas party. Okay. We're very happy to be partnering with Casa Italiana on the celebration of Italian culture with all of you this evening. Tonight we have another great program with a distinguished presenter, and we'll be getting to that in a few minutes. We're constantly striving to grow our organization, so if you're not a member of the AICR and would like to join, please give your name and address to Pat Constantino. She's sitting in the back row with a hand waving at everybody. Thank you, Patty. And we'll send you a membership application. All members receive our very informative 12-page quarterly newsletter and free admission to our events, which all take place here. On a sad note, one of our longtime attendees and supporters, Josephine Brown, recently passed away, so we are dedicating tonight's program to her and her memory and her support of Italian culture. May she always walk with God. Okay, now there's a video. Stefano Albertini, who runs Casa, couldn't be here with us tonight, but he pre-recorded a little speech, and he's going to introduce the person who will introduce our speaker. So I'll turn things over to Julia.
Welcome to New York University Casa Italiana, dear friends, and especially friends of the American Italian Cultural Roundtable. I'm coming to you from the screen rather than from the podium where I normally am, because at the moment in which you will be starting your event, I'll probably be in the dentist's chair for an extraction. I assure you, I'd much rather be in the auditorium in my comfortable seat, ready to listen to Joe Sciorra, but I couldn't not welcome you all back and commend all of you, starting with Bill Ronayne, your president, and every one of you for the work that the Roundtable has been doing over the years. And people like Joe and me that do this as our job cannot but admire the fact that people like you, whose job is not to promote awareness and cultural awareness in our community, have kept alive throughout the years this sense of belonging, and the sense that the belonging is not much something that runs in our blood as Italians, but that runs in our shared culture. So thank you so much, and Casa is happy to have you and to continue our collaboration with you. And of course, Joseph Sciorra, he's going to be introduced properly with all his titles and his publications that are many and impressive by somebody else. I believe Steve Cerulli, if I'm not wrong, and he's the perfect person to do that. But I have to commend Joe, because when I think of a public intellectual, I think Joe Sciorra. What is a public intellectual? Do not think of somebody that thinks by himself. It's the opposite of the intellectual in the ivory tower of academia. He's somebody who spends his life teaching, researching, understanding better, explaining, asking himself or herself questions. And that's what Joe Sciorra does. And when I met Joe, I thought to myself, that's such a shame that he's so brilliant, he doesn't teach, he doesn't have a class. And I was wrong, because Joe's class is the street, and Joe's students are our entire community. And his research is relevant to each one of us, and to each one of us in the community. And his research improves us and makes us a better, more aware, more conscious community of people with a shared past, with a shared culture. And in his work, especially the work that he did with Pete Panto, he really exemplifies this. He studied, he understood the case, he did archival research. And then there was an active part to his research that was put a name on the tomb and put a tombstone on a tomb. And in doing that, he showed that academic work, intellectual work, is not sterile, it's not only for ourselves. Pete Panto's tombstone is there for everybody who passes by, to get to know who Pete Panto was or what he did for our community. Not to mention that in one shot, Joe sort of fulfilled the two main obligations, both of Judaism. As you know, a mitzvah, a good action for Judaism, is something that cannot be compensated, that cannot be rewarded or paid back. And by excellence, whatever you do for the dead is that kind of mitzvah, because they cannot compensate you, that cannot pay you back. And of course, it's a work of mercy for all of us as Catholics, as bury the dead. Bury the dead means giving them a name, giving them dignity, and especially in the case of Panto, to recognize what they've done and be grateful for it. So I'm not there. I look forward to listening to the recording as soon as it becomes available. I'd much rather be there, but have a great evening, and I'm sure you're in for a treat with Joe Sciorra's presentation on Pete Panto. Thank you.
Okay, to introduce his colleague and our presenter tonight, our newest board member, Steve Cerulli.
Hello all, thank you for coming. You're gonna see I reach a very similar conclusion as Stefano. So I could do your standard introduction and introduce you to Dr. Sciorra via his credentials. He has a Ph.D. in folklore studies from the University of Pennsylvania. He's director of academic and cultural programs at the John D. Calandra American Institute, and he's the author of various articles and books such as Built with Faith, Italian American Catholic Material Culture in New York City. All of that is fantastic, but it truly does not capture who Joe is. Over the past 7 years, I've been lucky enough to get to know Joe as a colleague, a friend, and more recently, neighbor. I joked with him yesterday about being a folklorist, and that he is indeed. However, I would argue that within the Italian American community, whatever that may be, he embodies a much more important role, that of a cultural critic. Some hear the word critic and assign it a negative connotation, but what a critic does is get the group or society or movement that they're commenting on to be more thoughtful, more critical on how said entity or entities operate. In the case of Joe, that is the 17 million or so of us who identify as Italian Americans. Our colleague Fred Gardafe argues that Italian Americans do not know what they do not know. Anthony Tambori, a former speaker here, takes this a step further and argues that Italian Americans, especially Italian American leaders, have created and practiced a politics of self-omission. That is a self-omission from their ancestral languages, cultures, and history. In my research, I draw this out again and argue that Italian Americans have created convenient narratives for inconvenient histories. Joe's work captures all the above. From one angle, through his public discourse, he has taken a sage-like role to present to those who don't know what they should know. He has not allowed parts of Italian American history and culture to be admitted from the public discourse. Moreover, he challenges the convenient narratives for inconvenient histories. Joe's Pete Panto project reflects this all. It sheds light on the man and how deeply immersed Italian Americans were in an often radical United States labor movement. It also engages with the inconvenient history of Italian Americans and organized crime. Thanks to Joe, Pete Panto is omitted no more. In understanding her Italianità, her Italianness, Luis de Salvo described it as a critical process. In many ways, Joe's engagement with the Italian American community in the public forum is the same type of critical process that de Salvo was reckoning with. That process can be worked out in spaces like Casa Italiana NYU and through organizations like the American Italian Cultural Roundtable. So let us welcome Joseph Sciorra.
Wow. I'm really humbled by both presentations, introductions. They're really moving. Thank you, Stefano. Hope everything goes well at the dentist. And thank you, Stephen, for that lovely introduction. And of course, I thank the American Italian Roundtable, Cultural Roundtable, for this invitation. As those two introductions sort of alluded to, or stated very clearly, I'm very much dedicated to doing these kinds of presentations at various public fora, wherever they may be. It could be in a church basement, a social club, or a venue like Casa Italiana here. I think these things are critically important to do this kind of research, but also to get it out into the larger community, people who may not feel so inclined to read a book, an academic article. I think that that kind of research, or this kind of research in general, is really important, important to be brought out into the larger community. And I think that's especially true for a community like Italian Americans, who have a certain kind of notion, or some folks have a certain kind of notion of what Italian American history Italian American culture is. And as Stephen just said, it's something that is a much more complicated one than the kinds of ones that we see on TV or in sort of popular magazines. So with that, I'd like to present my talk on Pete Panto. I'm going to read from a document. It's much more easier for me. I hope it's not too boring for all of you. That's why I brought the PowerPoint. We'll keep things moving a little bit as we go on. So, where's Pete Panto? Memory and Commemoration of a Murdered Dock Worker and Labor Activist. The issue of memory and commemoration concerning historical events and personages is at the very center of my presentation tonight. My talk focuses on the docks of the 1930s Brooklyn, and specifically on the life, murder, and legacy of dock worker and labor activist Pietro Pete Panto, once heralded as Italian-American longshoreman's Harry Bridges, referring to the San Francisco labor organizer who was successful in reforming the horrid working conditions on the West Coast. Pete Panto is now considered a forgotten hero of the Italian working class in the United States. And I show this, you saw that initial photograph, and I switched to this one. For a long time, this was the only image, or images like this, poorly replicated from the newspaper. It was the only image that we had of Pete Panto. And the previous image is one that I was able to find in the New York Municipal Archives, and you see a much more clearer image of Panto. We get a much more closer look at who Pete Panto was. In our current moment, in which history itself has become a battleground of interpretive frames, and the country's collective narratives and origin myths are scrutinized for the ways in which certain individuals and specific moments have been elevated over time, sometimes literally on pedestals of monumental proportions situated on public grounds, while others have been downplayed, devalued, dismissed, or erased, especially those concerning the country's victims of slavery, of genocide, class exploitation, xenophobia, gender inequality, and homophobia, points to our understanding of how the ongoing concerns for and struggles on behalf of democracy and freedom are recounted and are actualized in the present. Retelling Panto's story and that of the primarily Italian immigrant men working the Brooklyn docks in the 1930s and their families is one that is inextricably tied to our current re-examination of past events and their relevance today. This is a critical story of labor history, but also significant for contemporary efforts on behalf of workers' rights. And we are all too aware of current struggles among auto workers, screenwriters, actors, employers of Starbucks and Amazon, just to name a few. From my perspective as a scholar of Italian American history and culture, Panto's story is important for what it tells us about what is remembered and what is discarded and forgotten in the construction of an ethnic group identity. What are the dynamics of cultural politics that establishes and perpetuates certain dominant narratives at the expense of others? What can a figure like Panto mean as an Italian American one in the 21st century? So let me say, and if you haven't gathered that from the two introductions, I am not a labor historian. In fact, I am not a historian. My knowledge of Panto and working conditions on the 1930s Brooklyn waterfront are based on extensive readings of various works by scholars and journalists, some of which are highlighted here. And if you're interested in learning more about Pete Panto, the conditions of dock workers, both in Brooklyn and even Manhattan, I suggest some of these books. These authors have written about Panto, dock workers, and the period from their respective points of view. And I urge you, as I say, to check out these works for a larger perspective on the topic. I relied as well for this talk on journalist Helene Stupinski, who shared her research with me. And we'll see some of the images that she collected in writing a New York Times article about Panto that came out last year. My scholarly training is as an anthropologist, as a folklorist, and an art historian, long interested in the ways in which various groups use artistry and public spaces as sites of commemoration, collective action, community identities, and placemaking. Whether it is a Puerto Rican community garden, spray paint memorial walls, and large-scale events like Italian American street feasts. Of late, along with my colleague Laura Roberto, I have been particularly interested in the historical and changing relationship Italian Americans have with the symbolic figure of Christopher Columbus. From an Italian American perspective, I can't help but seeing these ongoing debates about Columbus among Italian Americans in dialogue with the historical figure of Pete Panto, who fought and ultimately died for the rights of Italian American workers. You've seen this poster, it's upstairs, and hopefully you can pick one up and put it on your wall in memory of Panto. In 2001, literally it's the first thing I did at the Calandra Institute. I organized a scholarly symposium in honor of Panto and the dock workers at the City University of New York Graduate Center as part of my work at the Calandra Institute. In my effort to advertise this event in the Brooklyn neighborhood where Panto once worked, I walked around Carroll Gardens asking shop owners to hang posters in their front windows. At a pizzeria, a thin elderly man sporting a fedora and smoking a cigarette, when you could still smoke a cigarette in a pizzeria, as he nursed a cup of coffee, asked me what I was doing. When I began to explain, telling him about Panto and the conference, he interrupted me saying, "I know about Panto, but why do you want to bring that up now?" My reply was simple, so as not to forget. When I asked him about his memories about the docks, he dismissed me with the wave of his hand. My story today is one of historical retrieval, memory work, if you will, and of cultural activism. But before I discuss memory, let me first address history. The horrendous working conditions on the New York City piers, one of the world's busiest waterfronts, and especially the Brooklyn docks during the 1930s, was the result of a corrupt and mob-enforced union, the International Longshoremen's Association, the ILA. Joseph Ryan, dubbed King Joe, served as a union president from 1927 to 1953 and was elected president for life in 1938. According to Howard Kimmeldorf, the ILA was, quote, the least effective union in the country, an abject failure that violated practically every tenet of job control unionism, end of quote. The ILA did not serve its members, but instead provided and controlled labor for the benefit of the shipping companies, actively working against its members. That control, in turn, was overseen by gangsters, racketeers, and enforcers who had no qualms of using threats, physical violence, and murder to intimidate, to silence, and to terrorize working men and their families. Forrest Hilton has done much to map the deep intricacies and family ties of organized crime operating on the Brooklyn docks. Without getting into the web of names and affiliations, these figures are key to understanding the depth of corruption and terrorism that operated on the docks. And here you see a newspaper article, I forget the date now, 2002, and you're still talking about organized crime involved on the docks. The lucrative Brooklyn piers were under the control of Vincent Mangano, who would become the founding boss of the Gambino crime family. The docks were administered by mobsters who oversaw the 6 ILA locals, 20th century urban fiefdoms. Emil Camarada, Mangano's relative by marriage, was the ILA vice president. A key figure in the nefarious enterprise was Mangano's underboss, Albert Anastasia, who oversaw affiliation of Italian American and Jewish gangsters and hired executioners that would be dubbed Murder Incorporated. A significant element in this corrupt system was the ties to local and city politicians and the police that extended to the Catholic Church. The mobbed-up ILA officials, like Camarda, ran the local city Democratic Club, affiliated with the Irish American-dominated political machine, Tammany Hall, and the city and state's Democratic Party. Those in control of the docks offered campaign contributions for protection. As a Brooklyn longshoreman explained, quote, "They check up on us. After the votes are counted in the Italian neighborhood, they can figure out pretty much what percentage of the men voted as they were told. If too many voted the other way, a lot of men from that neighborhood found themselves without work, just as a warning," end of quote. According to historian William Mello, quote, "The waterfront union leadership had the political influence necessary to stall or restrain any investigation into claims of corruption and violence," end of quote. Labor historians have categorized dock workers at the time as being among the most oppressed and exploited sectors of the US working class. Longshoremen suffered the greatest number of work-related injuries and fatalities, second only to tree-topping workers. On the Brooklyn docks, workers were subjected to speed-ups and crew cutting, in which as little as 15 men were hired to do the work of 20. These working conditions were compounded and exacerbated by the infamous hiring practice known as the shape-up, in which scores gathered and scrambled 3 times a day to be picked by the hiring boss for the daily work crew. And of course, those of you familiar with the 1954 film On the Waterfront can see depictions of the shape-up. With 14,000 men, mostly Italian American, seeking employment on the Brooklyn waterfront, this surplus of casual labor was at the mercy of those who control the hiring, that is, the ILA and their mob enforcers. But the indignity did not stop there. Extortion, shakedowns, and kickbacks were as routine as the work injuries and the shape-up. Workers paid union dues that were not marked into their membership books. Kickbacks were required, up to 25% of one's salary, for the privilege of being considered for hire. In addition, workers were required to frequent local grocery stores controlled by the racketeers. Panto reported paying for haircuts he never received and could not seek on threat of losing his job. He had to buy grapes for winemaking at a store that charged inflated prices. He also divulged having to buy tickets for banquets and balls that sold more tickets than the venue could accommodate, up to 10,000 more tickets, and which were on occasion purely fictitious events. Howard Kimmeldorf, again, claims that up to $25 million was accrued, this is in the 1930s, was accrued annually from skimming union dues, payroll padding, wage kickbacks, loan sharking, and other rackets, not to speak of pilfered cargo. In addition, those Italian immigrants those who were undocumented would be threatened with deportation if they stepped out of line. So we see a continuation of history from the 30s to present day. So what happened in the 1930s that led Panto and his dock workers to lead a rank-and-file revolt against this exploitative and anti-democratic system? What happened was the aforementioned Harry Bridges in San Francisco and the 1934 strike up and down the West Coast and the resulting factory for the working class. Due to labor's vigorous battle, West Coast dock workers broke with the ILA 3 years later to form the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. And in 1935, Brooklyn workers with ties to the American Labor Party and the Communist Party began organizing a broad-based coalition for creating what they call the Brooklyn Rank and File Committee. 1,000 copies of the group's newsletter, Shape Up, was printed, modeled on the West Coast publication Waterfront Workers. And in 1936, East Coast longshoremen invited Bridges to New York City, where he spoke at Madison Square Garden to a 17,000 capacity crowd. And I can't help but think, was Panto in that audience when in Madison Square Garden when Bridges returned the following year as the president of the new ILWU? So who was P. Panto? Pietro Panto was born in Brooklyn on September 13, 1910, to Sicilian immigrants Carmelo, a decorative plasterer, and Domenica, a homemaker, and they married in 1900. When he was 2 years old, Domenica died due to complications during pregnancy. Based on a series of documents found online, marriage and death certificates, and ship manifests, it appears that Pietro was sent to live with his paternal grandmother in Messina, or in Messina province. In 1924, he enters Ellis Island, accompanied by his married sister, Catherine. And I was really fortunate in the past 2 weeks, the great-granddaughter of Catherine communicated with me on email. And so we are now beginning to correspond. She found out through various sources about the work done on Panto. So that was really exciting. This suggests that the 14-year-old Pietro had come to the United States for a brief visit because a year later, he completes the 6th grade in Italy. We know that he served in the Italian army as a private and then a corporal between the late 1931 to late 1933. It has been written that Panto was an anti-fascist and a refugee from fascist Italy, but I have not seen any corroborating documentation to these passing statements. In March 1934, the 24-year-old Panto enters Ellis Island to live with his father in Brooklyn. By 1937, Panto obtains his union card, and 2 years later, despite being a newcomer to the docks, he was a hiring foreman on the Moore-McCormick Pier. This important position was attributed to the fact that he was seen by other longshoremen as a leader, quote, a dynamic person, a good speaker in Italian, end of quote, who can rally the men to the arduous task of unloading the ships in a timely fashion. These qualities also served Panto in firing up the workers to the growing resistance movement in Brooklyn. Panto and the Brooklyn Rank and File Committee began organizing their open-air meetings in opposition to Ryan's union. In June 1939, 350 to 800 men rallied, and then on July 3rd, an unprecedented 1,500 longshoremen gathered on Columbia Street. Congressman Vito Marcantonio of the American Labor Party was an invited speaker. Wages were not the issue, but the democratization of the hiring process with a demand for a centralized hiring hall. Panto was soon being maligned. He was accused of being a communist. When that didn't work, he was offered $10,000 to stop his activism. ILA Vice President Emil Camarda told him plainly that, quote, some of the boys don't like what you're doing, end of quote. Panto in turn twice appealed to the district attorney's office for protection, which he did not receive. The details of Panto's murder are perhaps the most widely circulated accounts of this story, which I won't detail here with killer rap sheets and gory accounts. Suffice it to say that on July 14th, 1939, Panto was called to a nighttime meeting with what he called his fiancée, two rough mugs, and was driven in a car that included Camarda to a house in Lindenhurst, New Jersey. There he was met by Anastasia, and while resisting, he severely bit off the finger of his assailant. Panto was stabbed and strangled. The account of the killing was conveyed later by an informant, a statement that remained buried until 1952 during the subsequent New York State Commission on Crime. In the days that followed his disappearance, the question, dove Panto, where is Panto, began appearing on chalk around the docks. Dock workers soon formed the Pete Panto Memorial Committee. And this is the, as you can see, this is the missing persons notification that went out to the newspapers and elsewhere, circulated, trying to find Panto. And this is where we get that wonderful image of, clear image of Panto. And here we see a flyer that circulated around that time, trying to find Panto. So as I said, the dock workers soon formed the Pete Panto Memorial Committee to publicize his disappearance. Some of the members of the executive committee included author Richard Wright, Congressman Mark Antonio, and Michael Quill, leader of the transport workers. It was another informant, Abe Rellis, a Murder Incorporated killer, who provided information about the possible whereabouts of Panto's corpse. The DA's office dug for the better part of 2 months in a frozen field near the Passaic River until January 1941, they found Panto's decomposing body trussed with a rope inside a sack and covered in lime. That month, workers formed Il Circolo Educativo Pete Panto, the Pete Panto Education Group, to perpetuate Panto's memory and continue the fight for a democratic waterfront. Representative Marco Antonio sent a message to one meeting. I greet the people who are interested in the Pete Panto case. This case is of vital importance to organized labor. The members of organized labor and the people of the city of New York in general are not only interested in the apprehension of the killers of Pete Panto, but they are concerned with the apprehension and bringing to justice of those who hired the killers. Until those who were behind the assassination of Pete Panto are punished, no rank and file member of organized labor is safe. And I thank John Heyer, who is here in the audience with us, for this wonderful image. It wasn't until April that Panto's Catholic funeral was held. 50 members of the rank and file committee carried a large drawing of Panto decorated with flowers, while thousands lined the street to witness the mile-long cortege. The Brooklyn Eagle newspaper reported that the funeral expenses were paid for by the nickels and dimes donated by longshoremen, while the local funeral parlor run by Pasquale Scatto paid for the plot in a Long Island cemetery. The Pete Panto Memorial Committee issued the following statement. In the death of Pete Panto, organized labor has lost a great and courageous leader. He was murdered because he led the fight on the Brooklyn docks for better working conditions. In his death, the Italian people lost a son who symbolized the best tradition of the workers. Pete Panto lives in the hearts of thousands of longshoremen who are determined that the things he lived and died for shall not come to pass. Newly elected Brooklyn District Attorney William O'Dwyer, who went on to become the city's mayor and an ambassador to Mexico, took charge of the investigation. And yet, no one was brought to trial for Panto's murder. In 1945, a grand jury investigation included O'Dwyer had been grossly negligent in the Panto investigation. And in 1951, he was publicly shamed and his political career undone during the televised Kafafar Senate hearings on organized crime as he was questioned about his affiliation with crime figures and specifically with Albert Anastasia. And what of the Brooklyn dock workers in the aftermath of Panto's murder? Longshoremen and the neighborhood at large were terrorized. Workers associated with the rank and file rebellion were not hired. Pete Mazzi, who's seen here, Panto's right-hand man, was severely beaten on several occasions for his continued efforts. He was kicked out of the union and unable to find employment on the docks. He went to work for the city's transit system. The police and local authorities refrained from coming to the defense of beaten workers. With the war effort, historians have noted the Militant Congress of Industrial Organizations and the Communist Party activists took less confrontational tactics on the dock, to a large degree abandoning the radical longshoremen's movement in Brooklyn. And yet, the memory of Pete Panto and his fight on behalf of workers' rights and dignity were at the heart of actions and gains made in the post-war era with the 1945 strike, and especially in the light of journalist Malcolm Johnson's award-winning expose in 1949 of conditions on the dock, which subsequently resulted on the 1954 film On the Waterfront, winner of 8 Academy Awards, and subsequently the 1953 congressional establishment of the Waterfront Commission of New York Harbor, which was undone last year by a decision, dismantled by a decision of the Supreme Court. And yet, Pete Panto is a forgotten hero of the Italian working class in the United States. I first learned of Pete Panto in 1989 when I read an article in the now defunct Italian language daily America Oggi, detailing the history of this Italian-American labor activist. Accompanying the article was an interview, translated into Italian, with the playwright Arthur Miller, whose memoir, Time Bends, had just been published. In the book, Miller recounts how he, in 1949, learned about Panto and went on to write an unproduced screenplay called The Hook, based on Panto's activism. The Panto story was a complete revelation to me. As a Brooklynite and a scholar of Italian-American history, I had never heard of him. At the time, but also still to this day, as seen in this coloring book portraits posted on Instagram, non-academic, popular histories of Italian Americans that pop up almost always in October, considered to be Italian Heritage Month, seem to always promote mainstream feel-good heroes who contributed to the US history. Annette Funicello, Guy Lombardo, Chef Boyardee, and Mother Cabrini. In these accounts, Italian-American working class history was only suggested by evoking the wistful and nostalgic apparitions of immigrant ancestors who arrived with nothing and pulled themselves up by their proverbial bootstraps, an uplifting narrative that was fixed during the 1970s white ethnic response to the larger civil rights movement and remains the dominant one today. In these popular renditions of ethnic legacies, there's never any mention of real discussion of the actual struggles that Italian immigrants and Italian American workers waged. The 1912 textile strike, for example, the 1912 textile strike or the 1913 Patterson silk strike are not recognized by mainstream Italian American organizations at the time of the America Oggi article, nor was the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City, in which 146 mostly Italian Jewish girls and women died, it was not embraced as part of American history. And we are now thankful for the memorial that is here on the building south of Washington Square Park, which is a fitting commemorative to the women who died and some men who died at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, who was the impulse of Italian American, Jewish American, and other people concerned with workers' rights to bring that history to the forefront. And if you're, again, here in the area, please go down and visit. It's just south of the park at the Brown Building. Of course, this lapse of history has to do with the fact that working class Americans had been part of the American left, involved in one degree or another with such radical political movements as anarchism, socialism, and communism. And they were also involved with fascism and anti-fascism, another aspect of history that has been shuttled to the side in public proclamations of ethnic identity and American patriotism. The suppression of the American left in the first Red Scare during and after World War I, let us not forget Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, and the second Red Scare after World War II had taken its toll on Italian Americans as well as many others. As Italian American families established themselves in the middle class and embraced their whiteness in the post-World War II era, this radical past had become an uncomfortable truth, like an embarrassing relative folks want to silence or conceal during family gatherings. As a result, individual working class activists like Panto or Carlo Tresca or James Gropey or Angela Bambace and Tina Modotti, to name but four, as well as anti-fascists, are not championed as ethnic heroes, but banished from the constructed Italian-American pantheon of collective memory. And I should add that, though, in the subsequent years from the America Oggi article, numerous scholars, more than I can mention here today, have created an expansive body of work documenting Italian Americans' involvement with various progressive movements during the 20th century. And you should all look into that history. For me, Panto's story, tragic as it is, was a refreshing and some degree hopeful one, a history that helped expand my scholarly work on Italian Americans, as well as my own personal sense of ethnic identity. There were individuals from the past that I found truly worthy of praise and emulation. In this way, I felt a deep-seated commitment to retelling Panto's story, and in a sense, I became a contemporary member of Il Circolo Educativo Panto. So as part of my mission, I organized the aforementioned 2001 symposium, Italians on the New York Waterfront, a tribute to Pete Panto, soon after starting at the Calandra Institute, in which 3 scholars presented their studies on dock workers before, during, and after Panto's time frame. Recently, in writing about Italian Americans' association with Columbus, especially as it concerns public statues and monuments, I've thought again and again about Panto and the non-existence of any public commemoration or memorial for him in New York City, something the 1989 America Oggi article also observed. In the fall of 2020, as we experienced a brief reprieve from COVID before the next variant hit, my son and I decided to visit St. Charles Catholic Cemetery in Long Island to pay my respects to the murdered labor leader. To my surprise, we discovered that Panto was in fact buried in an unmarked grave. Some have speculated why this was the case, that Panto's family didn't have the money to pay for a headstone, that Panto's family fled the city in fear soon after his burial, and the lack of a marker was a way to keep the mob from finding his grave. We don't know. I found this absence an incredibly sad affair. For 62 years, this man who was assassinated for confronting a corrupt union and the gangsters on behalf of workers' rights didn't even have the decency of a tombstone. I mean, it just seems such a basic thing. I decided as part of my responsibilities at the Calandra Institute to see if I could place a marker on Panto's grave. I uncovered the plot's owners, the heirs of the funeral director Pasquale Scotto. And again, I thank John Heyer for really making all those connections happen. It was, all of this wouldn't have happened without John's help. I was able to obtain the necessary documents for the Catholic cemetery and develop the marker's design with the Brooklyn Tombstone Company. The inscription is an excerpt from the anonymous poem that graced the April 17th, 1941 issue of the newsletter Shape Up, that urged people to attend the Panto's funeral. Drop hooks, all you longshoremen, this Panto burial day, this working man from off the docks, our martyr in the fray. So creating a GoFundMe campaign, we quickly raised the necessary funds from people from Tacoma to Philly, donating as little as $20 to as high as $3,000. A few wrote personal dedications evoking relatives. I donate in memory of my grandfather Francesco, a longshoreman. My father was a longshoreman on the Brooklyn piers from the early 50s through the late 1970s. For Pete Panto, for every rank and file labor organizer lost to history, they live on through the millions whom they showed the power of a union. I just want to show you some images. A year ago today, literally today, on this day, after the tombstone was installed, a group of us gathered to commemorate Panto. Coincidentally, Panto was honored yet another way. Let me just go through these images. There's John actually speaking there in the bottom image. Coincidentally, Panto was honored in yet another way last year when the Brave New World Repertory Theater staged a theatrical adaptation of Miller's The Hook on a restored barge docked on the Red Hook Bay. And you could see 2 examples from that production with this wonderful image of Panto. There's one more thing I'd like to do to help make Panto's story better known to others, and I thank John Heyer for a 3rd time for his, because this was his suggestion. On the corner of DeGraw and Columbia Street is a small plot of land seen here. The Circolo Educativo Pete Panto was once located just down the block, and across the street was the first union hall that was created in the aftermath of Panto's murder. This was the very area where Panto worked. Very slowly, I've been exploring the possibility of naming the plot of land Pete Panto Park. Hopefully, as with the tombstone, we'll be able to accomplish that one day. Thank you. Happy to entertain any comments, suggestions. Yeah.
And the relationship with organized crime and how Italians were vilified for so many years and still are, actually.
Thank you. Yes, I think they're gonna, they wanna have the microphone because they're recording it.
Yeah, as now retired union activist, I really want to thank you for this. It's great. I'd never heard of this guy, completely unknown to me, and I'm one who does try to find this kind of history if it's available. Is there anything left of anything he wrote or said when he was organizing, or is it just about him and what he was doing?
Yeah, as far as I understand, there's no writing. There's no writing on him. And the quotes, there are some quotes about what he experienced on the dock when he testified to the district attorney, who in the end then never did anything for him. So there are those, I don't know if they're verbatim quotes, but there are accounts of him talking about the conditions there. But there's, nobody recorded him. I mean, he came up very quickly, right? 34 to 39, and he was working on the docks. He was an active laborer. So there's, as far as I know, there's not anything that's remained of his actual spoken words. There are very few pictures. There's one other image of him, which I haven't showed. You see, it's a frontal picture. It's kind of, the only image that I've seen is kind of blurry. It's online, and that's it. Yeah. No, he had a fiancée, and I don't know when they were supposed to get married. And Helene Stupinski, the journalist who wrote an article on the New York Times, actually traced where she went. She got married. She moved out of Brooklyn in the New York area, had a child. I think she was actually able to find a grandchild's phone number. Left a message, but there was nothing returned. Catherine's great-granddaughter doesn't know any, in the email that she wrote to me, and I think it was to someone else, she really had no history of Pete Panto. She, even in the family, that narrative was lost. Yeah, so he was born here, and then was brought to Italy. It seems like he was brought there twice. It seems like he was brought when his mother died, giving birth to a third child, because then we know that he enters through Ellis Island as an American citizen, but enters through Ellis Island, and then he comes back in 30. He goes back. He must have gone back to Italy, because then again he comes through Ellis Island once again in 34. What did I say? I'll have to look it up. Yeah, let me look it up. Yeah, let me, give me a second. So in March 1934, the 24-year-old Panto entered Ellis Island and then remained. Thank you. Thank you.
You want to, can we have another, pardon me?
Yeah.
I just want to have, we have another round of applause for,
Oh, there's a question. There's two. There's three. I see four.
My neighbors are in their 80s, and their father worked as a longshoreman. This apartment is close to the Hudson River, south of Canal Street. And I just wondered, could you give like a kind of a survey of the different nationalities that worked there during that time? You know, who were the Italians the largest, or was it some other nationality, et cetera, et cetera?
Sure. So as far as I understand, the Manhattan docks were dominated by Irish Americans. You know, the workers could be Irish, they could be Italian, they could be African American, Scandinavian. There could be a number of different peoples, but it was dominated by Irish American workers and, of course, labor or unions. Joe Ryan controlled all of that as part of the union. The Brooklyn docks were controlled by the union and the gangsters, but the predominant labor there was Italian American. I can't speak to Hoboken. Hey.
Hi, Joe.
Hey.
So I found this really interesting, and I have a few kind of abstract questions that I'm not sure you can answer, but you know, just thinking about the long-term historical trajectory of the collective memory of Italian Americans, and specifically thinking about who is, you know, taken up as an example of, you know, an immigrant that has made it, and thinking about this invisibility of people who struggled specifically to reckon with domination and specifically to try to become truly self-determined. I wonder what happened to these individuals. Did they have to migrate? Were they overly repressed? And what kind of neighborhood dynamics came to play? And then simultaneously, I mean, this might be like a long-term question or project, but I wonder also how the New Deal impacted some of these dynamics, right? Because the state became much more involved in regulation of all of these relations. And so I wonder whether what we see in terms of who becomes heroized is actually the impact of the New Deal, specifically propping up, you know, ethnic whites, but then simultaneously silencing all the struggle that led to the New Deal becoming possible. So I don't know what you think about that, but also it's just a neighborhood aspect, but then also like a labor one.
Right. That's a lot. And I'm not sure I can answer all of those questions. As I said, not a historian. My understanding from what the materials that I've read is that on the docks, the New Deal really didn't have much of an impact. Because the union and the gangsters were able to control and suppress any kind of investigation at the local or national level of the kinds of activities were going on. There are some works that are done, but it's not until after the war that that you begin to see any kind of progress happening. There's that investigation on terms of organized crime that starts to bring attention, right, to what's going on there. Not necessarily radically changing the situation, but that stuff is beginning to happen. Of course, then what happens in the late 50s, late 60s is the whole issue of containerization, and that the New York City docks become less relevant as those kind of ports move to Elizabeth, New Jersey, and elsewhere. So that the whole shifting of the docks in New York City takes a significant leap in a different direction as a result of that situation. That's one answer to one question.
I would say just the other one too. I don't know if you can speak to the point. The gentleman who was in the pizzeria with the cigarette said to you, "Why are you bringing this up now?"
Yeah.
I think that also has a lot to do with who the heroes become and how stories like this get buried, because culturally, the Italian doesn't bring up the past in this way with these kind of stories. Do you think that's true as well? Even in the kind of folklore stories that are perpetuated, you don't really hear these kind of stories.
Well, I think you don't hear these stories, as I suggested, because there was significant repression of there was repression coming from organized crime itself. I mean, you couldn't speak out. I mean, Panto was murdered. I mean, he wasn't the only one. And there was a kind of litany of people who are, there was somebody else who was murdered in the Brooklyn docks for some kind of activism. I don't remember the specifics of it, but I had read about it. But there's, you know, sort of daily suppression at all times. You know, one can argue, as maybe some have done, about, especially by Italian Americans and organized crime, is this idea of omertà, right? You know, that it's a cultural thing that comes from Italy and because of the mafia there in a place like Sicily and other places in the South. I think that's in operation as long as it serves individuals' needs. And in the case here, the suppression is significant, right? The domination is significant. When I was in that, you know, I showed that New York Times article from 2002, I think it was. I was doing this in 25 years ago. There was still, I mean, you could speak to this a little bit more than I, there was still in New York City an active presence of organized crime. I knew somebody from Williamsburg who worked on the docks, who went to the, there was a union hall or a union health center. I forget who it was named after. It was Anastasia, the brother, yes, who was supposedly the good Anastasia, or Anastasio, right? There was a vowel, Anastasio. Say again? There you go. He was very, and I wasn't talking to him about this history because I didn't really know it at the time when I was talking to him about something completely different in Williamsburg. But he was very guarded about what the situation was over in Carroll Gardens, Red Hook, South Brooklyn area. So, the suppression is real. The suppression is real. And I think that man in the pizzeria, I don't know what his relationship is to the history, the neighborhood, anything that could be part of the story of Pete Panto. But it leads one to think that the memory of the repression was still something still active for that man at that later date. I'm sorry I didn't answer all of your questions. Hopefully we'll take the train home and we can talk more on our way. If you could wait for please.
First of all, the mob is still controlling. I hope there's no mafioso here, but they're still controlling the cement masons union today. Okay, that's number one. I think also Italians don't want to discuss some topics. Maybe this is the reason the pizzeria meant, because Italians feel stigmatized to discuss anything that's untoward regarding our ethnicity.
The question then becomes, why isn't Panto or other people like Panto, like Tino Modotti or Carlo Tresca, why do those stories not get told? I mean, those are people like, a person like Carlo Tresca was a well-known figure in the United States. The question remains for me, why do all these stories, and they weren't fighting necessarily against the mob. Tresco's case, he was fighting against, fascism. Why do these stories not get told?
We have Meucci versus Adam Graham Bell.
Ah. Yeah. Steve, did you have Oh, that was the question. No wonder. You got ganged up on me.
Could we have another round of applause for Joe?
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending and for all your questions. Thank you, and thank you.
Thank you.